all of these intersections are forcing us to create really complex narratives. And I think centering disabled, queer, and I'll just like queer, trans voices of color get to the truth of things. I think people like really snippy, like, oh, this is the issue. It's like, actually, this issue has like 5, 6 different layers, and we need to address all of these, or the problem's actually going to stay the same. And it's hard work. So like, it's hard work if you're out here, you're like, okay, I'm going to fight for like Black folks being shot by cops. And it's like, well, actually, you know, it's like usually Black men. Actually, it's usually Black men without a college degree. Actually, it's like folks, oh, let's not forget about the Native and Indigenous folks. Oh, let's not forget that. So you go through all of this, you're like, okay, I've got all the facts. And then like, you find out that actually the vast majority of people are also have a disability. And so like, you have to hold a lot in your head. And it's not easy, but when you put like disabled, queer, trans, youth of color, who embody this and cannot escape it, who it's not like a fact they have to remember, but they know it because it's their experience, that's when you have an actual full movement. Like that's when you actually can do something, because it's getting to the truth.
I think another important part of intersectionality that a lot of folks don't address is class.
Yeah.
Socioeconomic class and class access, especially both in urban. There are unique challenges in urban and rural areas. I think one big challenge in these rural areas is access to resources, because you don't have access to transportation. Like, for example, Outright Vermont is with their centers and their resources is in Burlington. What if you live, what if you're poor, you don't have a car, you live 3 hours away from Burlington? You don't have access to those resources. So really getting access to resources, like regardless of class, I think is really important.
I grew up like dirt poor. And so I think that the experience of growing up in like extreme poverty also shifts your experience of like gender and sexual identity, because like rich kids that have more access to resources maybe have more access to resources generally. I don't actually know if that's true though. I think I can only speak from my own experience, which is that like as a poor queer person, that means that like my need to support my family is really high. And so like I have to suppress my queerness a little bit more than your middle class person because my family needs me. And it just gets really complicated.
Class is often erased in those conversations. So I think just bringing it into the conversation and like educating yourself and others about the importance of class as an intersection.
When we start thinking about kind of the intersections of queerness and transness and fatness, what starts to be really apparent is the ways in which queer and trans bodies are talked about in very othering ways in any literature around body, shape, size, and really any health things in general.
We have done the same thing with people's brains and bodies, that there's one way of being.
It also can just get really hard to get access to programs and to be treated well in them, because again, fatness and queerness are both seen as these, and transness are all seen as these signs of immorality, trauma, mental health problems, laziness, lack of control.
I think the barriers for those kids are people who are so rigidly attached to one way of doing things or one way of seeing things that they create environments that are not accessible to these kids, right? Because they're not thinking beyond themselves.
Being disabled or a person with a disability at any age
like interacting with the world is a lot the experience of encountering a system that was not built for you and trying to figure out how you can access it anyway.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking about disabled adults who might feel like they have no idea how to relate to a queer or trans young person. But that's also really the experience of being queer or trans in the world, right? Is continually encountering systems that were not built for you and trying to access them anyway.
Say, like, for example, if you live in a rural area and you're openly queer and you're, also disabled, your only access to a doctor is a doctor who's unaccepting of your identity. What do you do? Because you have to have access to medical care.
There's a very troubling overlap between pathologizing transness and pathologizing neurodivergence. And one of the ways that it happens is that when a kid is both, medical providers will often like make them pick one kind of. And with other kinds of, not just with autism, although that comes up a lot, but also with like all kinds of mental health diagnoses where young people will be told like, oh, I hear you that you're exploring gender and that you want to transition, but first we need to stabilize your moods. And after that, if you're still trans, then we can figure that out, right? Yeah. Or especially people who are diagnosed with intellectual disabilities, like, oh, well, you just must be confused. Like, you must just not be understanding that. And occasionally I've even seen it happen in the opposite direction, where someone like as an adult or a young adult is saying like, I think I might be autistic. Like, can I get some assistance to understand myself better and like figure out what I might want to do about this? And people are like, you're not autistic, you're just awkward because you're trans.
I think really like addressing access to resources for disabled, and also both like physical health resources and also mental health resources is really important, and definitely something that adults should have on their agendas when working with disabled queer folks and disabled queer youth.
And it's like access to healthcare, it's access to rest, it's access to housing, it's food security, and everyone can benefit from that. I think pushing on the idea of like accessibility of things, of like, oh, this is just for like these 3 people who might need this, and no, like creating access is for everyone. It's like, let's actually make this whole system accessible to people.
What folks can do is like create a channel or a way that you can ask people around their access needs.
A lot of queer spaces, while also being white, are also very centered on able-bodied folks, both as in terms of physical access, emotional and mental access to these spaces, and who's represented in these spaces.
In terms of our spaces, like making sure that folks can get in the building and doors are wide enough, especially bathrooms, which is part of ADA compliance, but it doesn't always happen. And make sure that spaces are fragrance free. Can also let people know what to expect in terms of giving like agendas or explaining the options. I think that's also part of like trauma-informed care, setting up the space intentionally so people can see where the exits are, giving different ways for folks to participate, giving roles, or having kind of more strengths-based, so recognizing that there's different kind of ways to participate and knowing that not one way of participating is more valuable than others. So some people might feel really welcomed and belonging and able to speak in a group of people, and that might not be how everyone is able to participate. So offering different kind of structures or ways for folks to engage that values different engagement.
My brother-in-law, he works with Planned Parenthood. And one of the things he always advocates for is making sure that people working in these communities come from these communities.
This idea of like, oh, we're going to bring these folks to the table, like to the proverbial table, as if like the table is yours and you're just, as if you own the table and you have this freedom to just like bring these folks in. You don't own these spaces, you're not bringing, like oh, I'm so benevolent and kind, I'm bringing these people into these spaces, but actually like making these spaces open and welcoming spaces that folks of color want to be in and are safe in.
If you're serving a community, you should already be having these conversations, like what is here, who's not being represented, how can we do better?
You know, I really love how the local racial justice center here in Brattleboro runs their meetings, where like white allies and POC gather together initially, and then they separate into their respective affinity groups, and then come back together. Just because I have this smaller community doesn't mean I'm separated from this larger community. It just means that we as human beings have depth, and we are completely intersectional, and we need the larger community just as much as we need the smaller community.
And that's what I think about with social justice work, is like we're putting these particular voices in the front, not so well, yes, like queer, trans, disabled folk need better lives, and we need to make a better world for that specific community, yes, because oppression, period. But it's also like creating a better world for everybody. Like we can all benefit from liberation. We can all benefit from things being more accessible. We can all benefit from less stress.
So I feel that what spaces need to do is do their own work and also identify community folk who can assist them in this work to take it further.
I think this is work that I still have to engage in myself, and will forever be engaging in.
I think what we need is that first realization that our experiences is different. It's completely different, which requires different responses and different strategic moves to be made to be able to meet those needs.
How can I do better in the future? And better does not mean bigger. It doesn't mean you're going to be an amazing all-star. Again, it doesn't mean that you are never going to make mistakes. It means that you are willing to engage again and again, and know that every time that you are making a mistake, that you are able to learn from that experience and do better again in the future.
Be open to addressing, your own racism, your own biases that exist within yourself and within your communities.
It is the desire to do better and the actions of actually doing better in the future that will get you closer to it.
This isn't a selfless endeavor. You also have a stake in it, but kind of like we all have a stake in our collective liberation. Mm-hmm. And the more people realize that, things stop being performative. We all start realizing like, oh, we're all actually caught up in making this world better.
Working with kids who are neurodivergent has made me question a lot of everything around interactions with people and ways of communicating and ways we send messages, whether it's overt or subtle, or because maybe that way isn't the way that it should be.
That correlation between neurodivergent youth and queer and trans identity is that we're talking about folks who are able to think outside of the box, who knows that the society that we are in and the culture that we are in is not currently supporting all members of our community. So how do we learn from youth and move away from this adultism, adult-centric mindset of we have more years on this earth and therefore we have more wisdom, rather than I have a set of wisdom and knowledge from my time here, and youth also have a set of wisdom in their time and are able to better help us to create a more welcoming environment or a more inclusive environment.
It's magical to really kind of understand the many intersections of neurodivergency and how it plays out. It really broke the mold of what I thought. We have these ways of thinking of what people should be like and how they should be and how they should act. And my experience here has just really tore that wall down. To remind and to circle back to this conversation that people are so unique, and it's so hard to put them in a box because we're not meant to be in one.
As an immigrant, like feeling like I don't really fully belong to Venezuela, but don't really belong fully to the United States. You know, the way I speak, even my first language nowadays, the way I speak it sounds weird to, you know, other Venezuelans who have never left Venezuela. So I think of the same way when I think about queer youth of color and their assets and what they can bring, like living in this intersection space of understanding the world from a much broader perspective and the way they see other people and understand and create it comes from a richer, more profound perspective that if they had just like this singular one experience.
I think that like queer and trans youth of color are pulled in so many different directions in terms of activism. When I was a youth and was like trying to get into activism, it was literally like, okay, are you, and I did like Occupy things, and it was just like, okay, are you going to the Black caucus? Are you going to the queer caucus? So oftentimes I was like literally like split in all these different ways. But I think that particularly in this moment, like people are understanding that an intersectional lens, intersectional tactics are what we need. And I think that's because we're realizing more and more people are realizing that oppressions are interlocking. And then if these systems of oppression are so nimble and interlocking and like getting us all, we also have to like resist in these interlocking ways.
I think of Gloria Anzaldúa, who was a lesbian, Chicana, Mexican-American, and who grew up by the US-Mexico border. And she would use that imagery of the border as sometimes that's literally like being by the border, right? US-Mexico border, and sometimes really metaphorically of living in between, you know, crossing and also living like in a third space of sorts. And she would talk about how she wasn't really fully accepted or fully embraced in, you know, queer communities because they were too white, and she was, you know, a Chicana, Mexican American, how she with her own, you know, ethnic, racial communities, right? All the Chicanos, Mexican Americans, Mexicans, wasn't all either fully accepted because she was now, you know, lesbian, and even the language, you know, she said she felt more comfortable speaking Spanglish, which is a mix of two languages, right? So I think about that as an asset, even though many people may think about it as a limitation. And yes, there are complexities and certainly things that can be painful about living in those, you know, with those experiences, not being fully accepted in any place, you know, or the places where you want to be accepted. But that also creates an openness and a sensitivity and a view of the world that is less constrained, right, by those binaries and those really rigid boundaries that really impact us all negatively, in my opinion.
Black queer women have like laid out all these frameworks for activism. That's just, they have. And so I think queer and trans youth of color, because they exist in so many simultaneous identities and ways, have like these really full, really broad ways of changing the world, of resistance, of shifting things, because in their one embodiment, they can see and feel and have experienced all of these different oppressions, and therefore like know exactly where to resist and what to change. So it's like, not only when I go to the bathroom, this thing happens, but when I interact with the state, this happens. When I try to get my ID, this thing happens. When I go home, this thing happens. And so like, they have a really, really good view of what needs to be changed. Like, and so we need to listen because they've got it. They've got what needs to be changed in the system.
I think at the end of the day, even across all of the intersections, it is that piece of seeing youth as our teachers, that we do not hold all of the wisdom moving forward, but that we can learn just as much as we can teach.
This year, during Pride Month, my daughter, my 11-year-old, came running out of her room and screaming in joy, like a joyful scream. Mom, did you know that? How did she phrase it? She said something along the lines of like, do you know that the leader, like the first Pride was initiated by a Black trans woman, and she was the one who threw the first brick, but she said it with such joy and pride, right? Like that sense of like, like one of my people did that.
I always, as a queer POC, my existence is my revolution. Like me existing in a space is how I change the system.